The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the quiet streets of Hollowbrook. Officer Greg Mason sat in his squad car at the intersection of Ford and Lexington, sipping the last of his lukewarm coffee. The radio on his dashboard crackled, with minor dispatch calls. Nothing urgent, nothing exciting. Another slow evening. Then he saw it. A motorcycle, weaving slightly as it approached the stop sign. The rider wasn't speeding, but something about the way the bike hesitated before coming to a full stop caught Mason's attention. Narrowing his eyes, he flicked on his squad car's lights. "Got a possible reckless driver on Lexington," he muttered into his radio, then flipped on his siren for good measure. The motorcycle pulled over immediately, the rider's hands calmly raised in a sign of compliance. Mason exhaled sharply, stepping out of the car, his boots crunching against the pavement. As he approached, he took in the biker's appearance: black leather jacket, sturdy boots, and a helmet with the visor down. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for the large dog sitting in the sidecar. A Labrador retriever wearing a harness with a distinctive guide dog symbol. Mason barely gave the dog a second glance as he stopped beside the bike. "License and registration," he ordered, resting, his palm on the handle of his gun, a subconscious habit more than a threat. The motorcyclist didn't move at first. Instead, he reached up and unclipped his helmet, lifting it off to reveal a scarred, weathered face. Mason noticed the faded military tattoo on his neck, the way his eyes didn't quite focus on him. Then, he saw it. The white cane strapped to the side of the motorcycle. Mason's lips pressed into a thin line. "You blind?" he asked before he could stop himself. The biker, Jake Carter, didn't flinch at the question. He exhaled through his nose as if he had heard it 1,000 times before. "Legally, yeah," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "But I can still ride. My guide dog, Shadow, helps." Mason frowned. "I don't think that's how it works." Jake sighed, already reaching into his jacket. "My ID and registration are in my inside pocket. I'm grabbing them now," he said, moving deliberately as if anticipating any reaction Mason might have. But before he could pull them out, Shadow let out a sharp bark. It wasn't aggressive, not quite. More protective, warning, a single sound that made Mason tense. The dog had been calm until now, but the moment Jake moved his hand, Shadow had positioned himself between Jake and Mason, his muscles taut. Mason's heart rate kicked up instinctively. His patience was already thin. This was a waste of time. A blind biker with a dog? Probably some wannabe tough guy trying to test the system. "Control your dog," Mason snapped. Jake, still keeping his movements slow, turned his head slightly. "He's just doing his job," he said evenly. "He's trained to..." "Yeah?" "Well, he needs to be trained to shut up," Mason shot back, his irritation mounting. Shadow growled softly, his posture unrelenting. Mason clenched his jaw. He hated when civilians tried to act like they knew better, like they were entitled to some kind of special treatment. Then, without thinking, he acted. With a swift motion, Mason kicked out, his boot connecting with Shadow's side. A sharp, pained yelp echoed through the street. The sound cut through the air like a knife, drawing the attention of pedestrians on the sidewalk. A few people turned, their expression shifting from curiosity to horror. Jake stumbled forward, his balance thrown off as Shadow collapsed momentarily from the impact. A wave of panic and fury flashed across his face as he immediately dropped, to his knees, feeling blindly for his dog. "What the hell?" Jake's voice rose, anger breaking through his normally steady tone. He found Shadow's body, his hands running over the dog's side, checking for injuries. Shadow whimpered but was already trying to get up, ever loyal, ever trained. Mason, meanwhile, felt a flicker of uncertainty. He hadn't meant to kick the dog that hard, just to push it back, just to show some authority. Then he heard the unmistakable sound of a smartphone camera recording. His gaze snapped to the right, a young woman in a hoodie standing on the curb, phone raised. Next to her, an older man had also pulled out his own phone, capturing the aftermath. Mason's stomach tightened, but his training kicked in. "Step back," he ordered Jake. "I asked for your ID and your dog was interfering." Jake's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice controlled. "You kicked a guide dog, officer." "It barked at me," Mason countered. "It barked because you were acting like a threat," Jake shot back. "That's his job." More people were stopping to watch now. Mason could feel their eyes on him, their expressions ranging from confusion to accusation. The air had shifted. He had lost control of the situation. Grinding his teeth, Mason pulled out his notepad, writing up a citation. "Reckless driving," he muttered as he scribbled. "You shouldn't be on the road if you can't see." Jake gave a hollow laugh, one that had no humor in it. "I've been riding for years. My license is legal, my bike is modified, and Shadow has been trained since he was a pup. I know the road better than half the drivers out here." Mason ripped the ticket from his pad and held it out. "Take it up with the department if you have a problem," he said coldly. Jake didn't. "Reach for it." "I can't see it, officer. Maybe you should hand it to my damn dog." For the first time, Mason hesitated. People were still watching. A few had their phones still up, waiting for his next move. Swallowing his frustration, Mason dropped the ticket onto Jake's motorcycle seat. "Stay out of trouble," he muttered, before turning back to his car. As he climbed into the squad car and pulled away, Mason could feel the weight of the moment sinking in, but he didn't look back. He didn't see the way Jake stayed on the ground for a moment, his hand on Shadow's fur, as the dog gently nudged him with silent reassurance. He didn't see the woman with the phone upload the video within minutes. He didn't see the headlines already forming online. "Police officer kicks blind man's guide dog during traffic stop, caught on camera." Mason just drove, unaware that his life was about to change forever. Mason sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at the muted television screen. The news played silently, but he didn't need to hear the words. The footage was everywhere. Shaky smartphone video, his squad car's flashing lights, the confrontation, the kick. The way Jake Carter had fallen to his knees, scrambling to check on his dog. The way Shadow had yelped in pain, his body curling slightly before forcing himself back up, still trying to protect his handler. Mason had barely slept since that night. He hadn't thought much of the incident at first. Another tense interaction, another motorist with a chip on his shoulder. But social media had turned it into something else entirely. The screen cut to a news anchor, the caption, beneath him reading, "Viral video, officer kicks blind veteran's guide dog." Mason exhaled sharply. Blind veteran. He hadn't even known that at the time. The video had exploded online within hours, spreading from local news to national headlines. Celebrities were tweeting about it. Animal rights activists were calling for his badge. People weren't just angry about police brutality anymore. They were furious about the treatment of a service animal. The department had received thousands of complaints overnight. And now, internal affairs was involved. At the same time, Jake Carter sat in a small office, his fists clenched on the desk in front of him. Across from him, an officer with a tired face and a clipboard was taking his statement. "I want to file a formal complaint against Officer Greg Mason," Jake said, his voice controlled but firm. The officer cleared his throat. "Are you aware? This will initiate an internal affairs investigation?" "I'm counting on it." The officer hesitated. "Would you like to press charges?" Jake exhaled through his nose, running a hand over Shadow's back. The dog was still slightly sore from the impact, though he hadn't let it show. Loyal as ever, stronger than Mason had given him credit for. Jake wanted justice, he wanted accountability, but would charges even stick? "No," he said finally. "Not yet, but I want his badge. That man shouldn't be wearing one." The officer nodded and made a note. "We'll be in touch." Jake stood up, gripping his white cane. Shadow immediately shifted into position beside him, guiding him toward the door. As he stepped out, he could hear the whispers of officers behind him. "That's the guy from the video. Damn. They're gonna eat Mason alive." Jake didn't. "Stop walking." "Good. Let them." Detective Lisa Raines sat at her desk, the case file open in front of her. She had watched the footage at least a dozen times already. The call had come down from the chief of police himself. Investigate Officer Mason immediately. Lisa had been in internal affairs for 5 years, and this wasn't the worst thing she'd seen. But the optics of it? This was a nightmare for the department, a blind veteran, a guide dog, and now the whole country wanted Mason's head on a pike. She leaned back in her chair, sighing as she looked over Mason's record. Several complaints over the years. Nothing major, but enough to show a pattern. Excessive force, poor judgment, a temper. Rains glanced over at the printed email from the mayor's office. The message was clear. The department had to act fast. Grabbing her notepad, she stood up and walked out of her office. It was time to talk to Mason. Mason sat in the Internal Affairs interrogation room, his hands folded on the metal table. Lisa Rains took a seat across from him, flipping through the case file before glancing up. "You know why you're here," Mason exhaled sharply. "The dog." "The service dog," Rains corrected. "For a blind veteran. Did you know Jake Carter was a Marine?" Mason hesitated. "No." "Did you know his dog was a retired K-9 officer?" Mason's head snapped up. "What?" Rains tossed a photo onto the table. It was a picture of Shadow, years younger, standing next to his former handler, a police officer from Mason's own precinct. His full name is Shadow, K-9 Unit, badge Tiamwo 482. Served 7 years with the force, specialized in search and rescue. Retired honorably. Mason's stomach dropped. He had kicked a fellow officer. Rains let the silence settle before leaning forward. "This is bad, Mason. And it's not just your usual mess up. This is national news. The department's looking for someone to take the fall. And right now, that's you." Mason clenched his jaw. "You think I meant to hurt the damn dog?" "I don't care what you meant. The public doesn't care what you meant. They see a uniformed officer kicking a guide dog, a retired police dog at that. You couldn't have made this worse if you tried." Mason exhaled slowly. "So what now?" Rains leaned back. "You're suspended without pay, effective immediately. There will be a formal hearing. If you're lucky, you walk away with early retirement. If you're not, you'll be fired, and maybe even sued." Mason scoffed, shaking his head. "This is bullshit." "No, Greg. This is consequences." Rains gathered her file and stood up. "Go home. Stay out of the spotlight." She paused at the door, looking back at him. "Oh, and one more thing," she said. "People like Jake Carter, they don't let things go. He's coming for you, and honestly, I don't blame him." She shut the door behind her. Mason sat there, staring at the table. For the first time, he realized his career might actually be over. Outside the police station, protesters had already gathered, signs with slogans like "Justice for Shadow" and "Fire Mason Now" filled the air. Animal rights groups, disability advocates, and veterans had all rallied together. The news crews were everywhere, waiting for a statement from the department. Inside his apartment, Mason scrolled through his phone, reading the comments flooding in. "Coward cop abuses a blind man's dog. Fire him already. K-9 served their whole lives protecting us. This officer disgraced his badge. Imagine being so power-hungry you assault a service animal." Mason put his phone down and ran a hand over his face. There was no coming back from this. Not this time. Jake Carter sat in front of a microphone, a reporter across from him. Shadow lay at his feet, as calm and steady as ever. "Jake, millions have seen the video. What do you want people to know?" Jake inhaled deeply. "I want people to know that what happened to me happens all the time. Maybe not with a dog, maybe not caught on video, but police officers like Mason, they think they can do whatever they want with no consequences." The reporter nodded. "And what do you want to see happen?" Jake didn't hesitate. "I want Mason off the force. I want accountability, and I want people to understand that service animals aren't just pets. They are lifelines. Shadow is more than my guide. He's my partner. He's a retired K-9. He's given everything for this country, and he was kicked like garbage." The interview ended. The public outrage intensified. Mason's hearing was scheduled. And whether he liked it or not, his reckoning was coming. The house was eerily quiet when Jake Carter stepped through the front door. Too quiet. He had barely had a moment to process the chaos of the last few days, the media storm, the protests, the calls from advocacy groups. Shadow had been his one constant, his rock through it all. But now, something felt wrong. Jake set down his white cane, listening carefully. Shadow, silence. His stomach tightened. Shadow always greeted him when he walked in. Always. The familiar sound of claws against the hardwood floor, the warm press of fur against his leg. But now? Nothing. He reached out, feeling along the usual spots. The dog bed in the corner, empty. The kitchen, nothing. His heart pounded as he took a shaky breath and forced himself to move toward the back door. He kept it locked, but maybe his foot hit something. Jake crouched down, running his hands across the floor. His fingers brushed against leather. He froze. It was Shadow's collar, ripped apart. Jake's hands shook as he traced the torn fabric. Shadow never took his collar off, never. This wasn't an accident. Someone had taken him. A wave of panic and fury crashed over him. Shadow was more than a guide dog. More than a retired K9, Shadow was family, and someone had stolen him. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but we don't usually investigate missing pets." Jake clenched his jaw, gripping the edge of the police station counter so hard his knuckles turned white. "He's not a pet," Jake snapped. "He's a service dog, a retired K9 officer." The desk officer, some rookie who probably didn't even know what a K9 unit was, sighed. "Look, I'll file a report, but—" "No, you'll do more than that," Jake growled. "You'll actually do your job." The officer hesitated. Jake didn't give him a chance to brush him off. He slammed his hand on the counter. His collar was ripped off. This wasn't him wandering off. Someone took him. Still, there was no urgency in the cop's voice when he responded. "Sir, we don't have any leads. If a dog is stolen—" "Not just any dog," Jake interrupted, his voice deadly calm. "He was one of yours, a police K9. So if you're telling me you don't care, I need you to say it clearly so I can record it." The rookie paled. Jake heard a new voice behind him. "Carter." Jake turned his head slightly at the sound of the voice he hated most. Officer Greg Mason, the man who had kicked Shadow, the man whose career was hanging by a thread because of it. Mason stepped forward, his voice low. "Come with me." Jake hesitated. Mason had no business talking to him. But at this point, Jake didn't have a lot of options. He turned toward the rookie officer one last time. "If you're not going to do your job, I'll find someone who will." Then he followed Mason out. Jake had no reason to trust Mason. And yet here he was, sitting across from him in a small diner, gripping a cup of coffee he wasn't even drinking. Mason was silent at first, watching him carefully. Then he spoke. "I saw the report," Mason said. "They're not going to do anything." Jake let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, no shit." Mason exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "This is my fault," he admitted. "I screwed up. Stop," Jake interrupted. "I don't want your damn apology." Mason went quiet. Jake turned his head slightly, not looking at him but seeing right through him. "I don't trust you," Jake said bluntly. "I don't like you, but Shadow is out there and I can't find him alone." Mason met his gaze. "Then let me help." Silence stretched between them. Jake hated this. Hated needing Mason. But Shadow was everything, and if Mason was actually useful, he wasn't going to let pride get in the way. Finally, Jake nodded once. "Fine." Mason leaned forward. "Where do we start?" The first clue came from a neighbor. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who lived across the street, had seen something. "There was a van," she said, her voice shaking. "Late last night. No license plate. 2 men, big, rough-looking, standing outside your fence." Jake tightened his grip on his cane. "You saw them take Shadow?" She hesitated. I saw them put something in the back of the van. And then I heard a dog whimper." Jake felt like he couldn't breathe. Mason spoke up. Did you see any markings on the van? Mrs. Rodriguez thought for a moment. It had a spray-painted logo on the side. Looked like a pit bull with, I don't know, something behind it. Mason's expression darkened. I know that logo, he said. Jake turned his head toward him. What is it? Mason hesitated. Then he answered. It's a dogfighting ring. Jake's blood went cold. Dogfighting. That meant Shadow was in real danger. That doesn't make sense, Jake said. Shadow's a service dog. He's not built for that. Mason shook his head grimly. Doesn't matter. Some of these guys steal well-trained dogs to use as bait. Jake's stomach lurched. Shadow, his loyal, disciplined, brilliant Shadow being torn apart in some underground ring? Not happening. Mason could see the fire in Jake's expression. We don't have much time, Mason said. If they took him, we need to move fast. Jake stood up immediately. Then let's go. Mason grabbed his jacket, tossing a few bills onto the table. As they stepped outside, Jake turned toward him. Tell me everything you know about these bastards, he said. Mason's jaw tightened. I used to run raids on them, Mason admitted. They move locations a lot, but I know some of their usual spots. Jake nodded sharply. They were going to find Shadow, and God help whoever took him. The tension inside Mason's car was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. He couldn't see Mason's face, but he didn't need to. The cop had been quiet ever since they left Mrs. Rodriguez's house, his fingers gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. Jake wasn't sure what was worse, the silence, or the fact that he had to rely on a man he despised. Ray Delgado, Mason finally said, breaking the silence. Jake turned his head slightly. Who? Mason exhaled through his nose. People call him Bones. Runs a lot of underground fights. Dogs, people, anything that makes money. He's bad news. And worse, he has friends in high places. Jake's gut twisted. Cops? Mason nodded. Jake scoffed. Of course he does. Mason clenched his jaw but didn't argue. Delgado's been untouchable for years. Mason continued. Every time we tried to take him down, he slipped through. Someone always tipped him off before the raids. Jake shook his head. And you expect me to believe you weren't one of the dirty cops protecting him? Mason slammed the brakes at a red light, turning his head sharply toward Jake. I may be an asshole, Carter, but I'm not a crooked cop. Jake faced forward. He didn't trust Mason. Probably never would. But right now, Shadow was out there, suffering, and he didn't have time for grudges. What do we do next? Jake asked. Mason's knuckles tightened on the wheel. We start knocking on doors. Mason took Jake to the kind of place no cop should ever be seen in, a bar on the outskirts of the city. No name, no windows, and a reputation for being a breeding ground for criminals. The moment they stepped inside, conversations died down. Jake could feel eyes on them, watching, judging. You sure this is smart? Jake muttered. Mason didn't answer. He just walked straight to the bartender, a bald man with prison tattoos covering his arms. Looking for someone, Mason said, sliding a $100 bill across the counter. The bartender barely looked at it. Ain't seen nobody. Mason sighed. Bones Delgado. The room seemed to grow colder. Jake couldn't see it, but he could hear the way chairs scraped, the way bodies shifted. People were listening. Don't know him, the bartender said flatly. Mason nodded as if expecting the response. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, not for his gun but for something even more dangerous. A police badge. The bartender's face darkened. You're out of your jurisdiction, cop. Not looking for a bust, Mason said. I just want to know where the dogfights are happening. The bartender hesitated, but the money was still there. And the thing about people like him, they were always willing to talk for a price. You didn't hear this from me, the bartender muttered, but they move fights around. Right now, warehouse on 8th and Grand, but you'll need an invite. Mason's lips pressed together. He turned to Jake. Looks like we're getting creative. The deeper they dug, the worse the truth became. This wasn't just about Shadow. Mason and Jake spent the next 2 days gathering intel, tracking down sources, and finding patterns. Dogs were being stolen all over the city. Expensive breeds, guard, dogs, service animals. The worst part? Many of them weren't being used for fights. They were being used as bait. Jake could barely contain his rage. Shadow wasn't just a fighter, he was valuable. A highly trained K9, which meant Delgado wasn't just keeping him alive for sport. He was making money off him, but they were running out of time. And then finally a lead came through. Mason got the text first. A contact, a former informant, had sent him a picture, a crumpled piece of paper with names on it, dogs with numbers beside them. Shadow's name was on the list. Beside it, a date, 3 days from now. Jake's fists clenched as he heard the news. They're putting him in a fight. Mason nodded grimly. Yeah, and if we don't stop it, Shadow's gonna be dead before sunrise. It was past midnight when Jake sat on the steps outside Mason's apartment. He hated being here, but he had nowhere else to go. Mason stepped outside, his expression unreadable. Couldn't sleep? Mason asked. Jake let out a bitter laugh. Could you? Mason sat beside him for a long moment. Neither of them spoke. Jake exhaled sharply. Why are you helping me? Mason was silent. Then finally he spoke. Because I screwed up, he admitted. Because I lost my way, and because if I can't fix what I've done, then I don't deserve this badge. Jake listened carefully, trying to read between the lines. Mason wasn't just here for Shadow. He was here for himself, trying to claw his way back from the mess he had made. You can't fix everything, Jake muttered. Mason sighed. Maybe not, but I can try. Jake nodded slowly. They still weren't friends. They never would be. But right now they had a job to do. They had to save Shadow, and time was running out. Mason stood outside the precinct, hands in his pockets, staring at the building. He had spent years calling home. His badge still carried weight for now. But after his suspension, after the media firestorm, he was no longer one of them. That didn't mean he was done trying. Taking a breath, he pushed through the glass doors, his presence immediately drawing stares from officers passing by. Some gave him a quick nod, others whispered. A few just glared. He ignored them and made his way to the one person who might help. Sergeant Paul Hendricks. Hendricks had been his training officer years ago. A no-nonsense, by-the-book kind of cop. If anyone still had some integrity in this place, it was him. Mason knocked on his office door. Come in. Hendricks was sitting behind his desk, thick arms folded across his chest, watching him closely. Mason, Hendricks said, you've got some nerve showing up here. Mason closed the door behind him. I need a favor. Hendricks sighed. You need a lot more than that. Mason ignored the jab and pulled out the list of stolen dogs. Delgado is running a dogfighting ring, he said, placing the paper on the desk. High-value dogs, stolen from homes, including a former K9. Hendricks glanced at the paper but didn't pick it up. I know, he said. Mason blinked. You know? Hendricks leaned back, exhaling. Half the department does. A chill ran through Mason's spine. And you're just letting it happen? Hendricks' expression darkened. You think I like this? You think I don't want to take Delgado down? He shook his head. We've tried. But every time, someone higher up pulls the plug. Mason felt his jaw tighten. So that's it? You just let it slide? Hendricks looked at him, eyes cold. You're suspended, Mason. Which means you're not a cop right now. Which means, if you keep digging, you're just some guy getting in the way of real work. Mason clenched his fists. This is real work, he muttered. Or did you forget what the badge is supposed to mean? Hendricks' face twitched, just for a second. Then he sighed. Get out of here, Mason. And if you're smart, you'll stay out of this. Mason grabbed the list off the desk and left, his blood boiling. Jake could feel the tension radiating off Mason as they sat in the car later that night. Didn't go well, huh? Jake muttered. Mason let out a dry laugh. Understatement. Jake exhaled. So the cops aren't going to help? Mason's fingers drummed against the steering wheel. No. But we already knew that. Jake leaned forward. Then we do this, our way. Mason hesitated, glancing at him. And that means? Jake turned his head toward him, his expression set in stone. We stop waiting. We take action. They had tracked down another stolen dog, a German shepherd named Rocky, set to be transported to one of Delgado's training facilities. The warehouse was on the edge of an industrial park, surrounded by chain-link fences and patrolled by men who looked like they had done serious time. Mason and Jake waited until nightfall before making their move. They crept through the shadows, avoiding the guards, listening carefully. Then Jake heard it. A faint whimpering. He turned his head toward the sound, his heart pounding. "He's close," Jake whispered. Mason nodded, moving forward cautiously. They slipped through a side door into a dimly lit back room filled with metal cages, dogs, some growling, some whimpering, all terrified. Jake reached out blindly, feeling the bars of the nearest cage. "Rocky?" A deep whine answered him. He crouched down, feeling a large, trembling body press against the bars. Mason quickly pulled out bolt cutters and snapped the lock. The door swung open and Rocky lunged forward, licking Jake's face in relief. Jake grinned for the first time in days. Then everything went to hell. A voice rang out. "Hey!" Jake barely had time to react before a fist slammed into his ribs, knocking the air out of him. He collapsed to the ground, pain exploding in his side. Mason spun around just in time to block another attacker, throwing a wild punch into the man's jaw. More footsteps, more voices. They had been made. Mason grabbed Jake's arm, yanking him up. "Move!" They bolted for the exit, Rocky racing beside them, barking wildly. A gunshot rang out, shattering the glass door as they barreled through. Jake's head was spinning from the pain in his ribs, but he didn't stop running. They didn't stop until they were blocks away, lungs burning, adrenaline pumping. Mason cursed under his breath, glancing back at Jake. "You okay?" Jake gritted his teeth. "Peachy." Mason shook his head. "We got lucky." Jake turned toward him, his face still twisted with pain, but his voice was hard. "We're running out of time. Shadow doesn't have 3 days. We need to end this. Now." Mason nodded, but his expression was grim. Because the next time they got caught, there wouldn't be a second chance. Mason was at home patching himself up when his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A low, familiar voice spoke. "You need to stop." Mason's blood ran cold. "Hendricks?" A pause. "Walk away, Mason," Hendricks said. "You don't know how deep this goes." Mason sat up, gripping the phone tightly. "How deep?" Hendricks let out a slow breath. "Delgado isn't the top of the chain," he admitted. "There are people above him, people you don't mess with." Mason's gut twisted. "So what? We let them keep doing this?" "I'm telling you as a friend," Hendricks said, his voice quiet. "Let this go." Then the line went dead. Mason sat in silence, his mind racing. The corruption wasn't just in the department. It was higher than that. He could walk away, protect himself. But then he thought of Shadow, of Jake, of the countless dogs being thrown into cages, beaten, broken, and discarded. Mason clenched his fists. Screw that. Meanwhile, in a dark, filthy training pit, Shadow was being pushed to his limits. His once sleek, well-kept coat was now matted with dirt and sweat. His paws were raw from being forced to fight smaller, weaker dogs, breaking them down to turn him into a killer. Delgado stood above the pit, watching with cold amusement. "Not bad," he muttered. "We'll see how he does in the ring." Shadow panted, his golden eyes filled with a silent, unbreakable defiance. He was hurt, exhausted, but he wasn't broken. Not yet. And deep inside, he knew. Jake was coming. Mason sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, staring at his police badge. It no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a lie. For years, he had ignored the cracks in the system, pretending that the rot within his department wasn't his problem. He had followed orders, looked the other way, convinced himself that fighting back would do nothing but get him buried. But now, he had a choice. He could walk away, save himself, and let the corruption continue. Or he could burn it all down. He grabbed his phone and dialed. "Hendricks," came the gruff voice on the other end. "We need to talk," Mason said, "and don't bother telling me to let this go." A long pause. Then, "Meet me in an hour." Hendricks chose a quiet, out-of-the-way diner, the kind of place where cops and criminals alike held private conversations. Mason slid into the booth, across from him, keeping his voice low. "I want to know everything," he said. "Who's protecting Delgado?" Hendricks exhaled, rubbing his face. "Do you know how long I've been playing this game, Mason?" he muttered. "Long enough to know that men like Delgado don't survive without permission." Mason leaned in. "Whose permission?" Hendricks hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Captain Reynolds." Mason felt his stomach drop. Captain Reynolds, the man who had mentored him, guided him through the ranks. The man he had once admired. "That's not possible," Mason said, shaking his head. Hendricks gave a dry laugh. "Isn't it? You think we've never had dirty captains before?" Mason clenched his fists. "And what happens if I take this to internal affairs?" Hendricks' face darkened. "They'll shut you down, or worse." He fixed Mason with a hard stare. "If you go after Reynolds, you better be ready to lose everything." Mason sat back, his pulse pounding. He had spent his whole career believing in the system. But if the system was rotten, then there was only one thing to do: burn it down. Mason found Jake sitting on the steps outside his apartment, a cigarette between his fingers. Jake didn't smoke, but Mason knew it wasn't about the cigarette. It was about having something to do with his hands. Mason sat beside him. After a long silence, he said, "I was wrong." Jake didn't look at him. "Which part?" Mason exhaled. "All of it." Jake took a slow drag. "Be specific." Mason ran a hand through his hair, struggling for words. "I kicked your dog," he admitted. "And I didn't think twice about it. I was pissed off, impatient, and..." He swallowed hard. "I saw you as a problem, not a person." Jake flicked his cigarette away. "No argument there." Mason turned to him, his voice rough. "I got into this job because I wanted to help people. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people as people." Jake clenched his jaw. "And now?" Mason's throat tightened. "Now I see you, and I see the system for what it really is." Jake was quiet for a long time. Then he sighed. "That's a nice speech, Mason," he said. "But words don't mean shit. Actions do." Mason nodded. "Then let's get Shadow back." Jake turned to him at last. "And how the hell do we do that?" Mason exhaled. "We go inside." Mason laid out the plan in Jake's apartment, a messy, cluttered space that smelled faintly of dog fur. Delgado's next fight was being held in an abandoned train yard, a place where the cops never showed up because the cops themselves were in on it. "You can't just walk in," Jake pointed out. "You're a cop." Mason smirked. "Not tonight, I'm not." He pulled out a forged entry pass stolen from an informant who had gotten a little too chatty. "This gets me in as a buyer," Mason explained. "They don't just bet on dogs, they sell them. If I act like I'm interested in their business, I get close enough to find Shadow." Jake frowned. "And me?" Mason hesitated. "This isn't a place for a blind man, Carter." Jake's expression hardened. "You think I don't know that?" Mason sighed. "You'd be a liability." Jake stood up sharply, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm the only damn reason you even give a shit about this," he snapped. "And you think I'm going to sit on the sidelines?" Mason met his glare, then nodded slowly. "You'll go in as my partner," he said. "But you listen to me, Carter. We do this smart, or we don't do it at all." Jake exhaled. "Fine." Mason extended his hand. Jake hesitated. Then, for the first time, he shook it. They spent the next 24 hours gathering supplies, weapons, and contacts. Jake wasn't much of a fighter, but Mason had him practice using a collapsible baton, something he could wield without needing precise aim. Mason, meanwhile, contacted a journalist he trusted, slipping her the information about Reynolds's corruption. If something happened to him, the whole city would know the truth. By the time night fell, everything was set. Jake stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the cheap suit Mason had picked out for him. "I look ridiculous," he muttered. Mason smirked. "Welcome to undercover work." Jake adjusted his tie, taking a slow breath. Then he turned toward Mason, his face set in stone. "Let's go get my dog." Meanwhile, in the underground pit, Shadow stood in the center of a circle of men, his body battered but unbowed. Delgado watched with a cruel smile. "This is it," he murmured. "Time to see if you've got the killer instinct." A smaller, weaker dog was pushed into the pit. It cowered, ears flat, trembling. The crowd began chanting, urging Shadow to attack. Delgado leaned forward. "Kill," he ordered. Shadow stared at the smaller dog, his golden eyes filled with something that wasn't fear, but defiance. He didn't move, didn't attack. He just stood there, silent and strong. Delgado's smile faded. He hated when they refused to break. "Fine," Delgado muttered. "We'll make you fight for real tomorrow." He nodded to one of his men. "Throw him back in the cage. If he won't fight, he'll die in the ring." As Shadow was dragged away, his mind didn't break, because deep inside he knew Jake was coming for him. And this time, Shadow was going home. The abandoned warehouse loomed like a forgotten monument to corruption, its rusted walls and shattered windows a perfect backdrop for the filth happening inside. It sat at the edge of an industrial district, isolated enough that no one would hear the screams, human or animal. Mason and Jake sat in the white car parked a block away. The lot surrounding the warehouse was packed with luxury cars and motorcycles, a stark contrast to the decay of the building itself. The people inside weren't just low-life criminals. They were wealthy investors, gambling away fortunes on suffering. Mason exhaled, rolling his shoulders. His badge wouldn't save him here. "Final check," he muttered. Jake adjusted the hidden earpiece Mason had given him. "I can hear you." Mason tapped his own. "Good. Keep the line open." Jake turned his head toward him. "Let's go. Over this one more time." Mason glanced at the crowd gathering at the entrance. "I go in first," he said. "Security detail. You stay here, out of sight, until I give you the signal." Jake frowned. "I don't like waiting." Mason gave him a hard look. "If something goes wrong, you're my backup." Jake's fist clenched. "Shadow doesn't have time." Mason nodded. "Then let's make this quick." Mason walked toward the side entrance, his stolen security badge clipped to his belt. His posture was stiff, his expression blank. He had worn this look 1,000 times before. A large bouncer, tattoos up his neck, eyes dead with apathy, blocked his path. "New guy?" The man grunted. Mason nodded. "Yeah, got called in last minute." The bouncer stared him down for a moment before stepping aside. "Stay out of the VIP section," he muttered. "And don't touch the damn dogs." Mason forced a smirk. "Wouldn't dream of it." He stepped inside, his heart hammering. The stench hit him first. Sweat, blood, cheap liquor, and wet fur. The warehouse had been transformed into an illegal arena, the center dominated by a fenced pit, where fights were about to begin. A crude metal cage held the dogs waiting their turn, their eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. Around the pit, gamblers waved stacks of cash, their laughter and cheers mixing with the distant whimpers of injured dogs. Mason scanned the area. Delgado was front and center, lounging in a chair like a king surveying his kingdom. His muscle-bound goons flanked him, hands resting on their weapons. And then Mason saw him. Shadow. The dog was dragged toward the pit, his black and tan fur matted with dried blood. He walked with a limp, but his head was still high, his golden eyes burning with defiance. Mason clenched his fists. Time to move. Jake sat in the car, his fingers tapping anxiously on his thigh. He hated this. Sitting still, doing nothing. Then Mason's voice came through the earpiece. "It's time." Move. Jake's pulse spiked. He slipped out of the car, feeling the cool night air against his skin. The back entrance was locked, but Mason had warned him about that. Jake ran his hands along the doorframe, feeling for the latch Mason described. His fingers brushed against metal. There. He pulled out a small pry tool and worked the lock. It clicked open. He stepped inside. In the arena, the announcer stepped into the pit, his voice booming over the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, our next match, a test of strength, endurance, and willpower, the crowd roared. Delgado leaned forward, eyes gleaming. Mason, keeping close to the walls, inched toward the cage. He was seconds away from making his move when the announcer's voice made his blood run cold. In this corner, we have a former police K-9 trained to serve and protect. Let's see if he can learn a new trick, how to survive. The crowd laughed and jeered. Mason gritted his teeth. The announcer turned, gesturing toward the opposite side of the pit. And facing him tonight, a two-time champion, undefeated in the ring, the beast himself, Reaper. The gate opened, and Reaper entered, a massive Rottweiler built like a tank, his body covered in scars from previous fights. His handler had to use 2 chains just to keep him under control. His eyes locked onto Shadow like a predator. Mason's pulse pounded. If he didn't act now, Shadow wouldn't survive this. Just as the handler released Reaper's chains, Mason struck. He grabbed a metal baton from his belt, lunging at the nearest security guard. Crack! The guard dropped like a stone. The commotion sent a ripple through the crowd. Confused voices rising. Mason ripped a smoke grenade from his jacket, yanked the pin and tossed it into the arena. Boom! Thick gray smoke exploded into the air, swallowing the pit in chaos. The crowd screamed, pushing back from the fence. Mason bolted toward Shadow's cage, shoving a guard aside. The lock was rusted but strong. He pulled out bolt cutters, clamping down. Snap! The door swung open. Shadow didn't hesitate. He lunged toward Mason, teeth bared, ready to attack. But then, he sniffed, a flicker of recognition in those sharp eyes. Mason held out a hand. Easy. Boy, Shadow hesitated. Then, he stepped forward. Mason clipped a makeshift leash onto his collar. Let's get out of here. But then, gunfire. Bullets ripped through the smoke and Mason ducked, shielding Shadow as the warehouse erupted into chaos. Delgado's voice cut through the noise. Find them! Kill them! Mason's stomach twisted. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped, and Jake was still inside. Jake pressed his back against the wall, listening. Gunfire. Screaming. Shit. His instincts screamed go, but his training told him to wait for his moment. Then, footsteps. A guard ran past him, coughing through the smoke. Jake moved fast, swinging his baton hard. Crack! The man hit the ground. Jake exhaled. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself forward. Shadow was close. He just had to find him. Mason dragged Shadow toward the exit, but Delgado stepped into their path, a gun in his hand. You think you can just walk out of here? Delgado growled. Mason glared at him. You're done, Delgado. Delgado smirked. I don't think so. He aimed the gun. Bam! A baton flew through the air, slamming into his wrist. The gun clattered to the ground. Mason spun. Jake stood behind him, breathing hard. Shadow whimpered. Jake turned toward him, voice breaking. Shadow. A heartbeat. Then, the dog lunged at him. Not to attack, to embrace him. Jake sank to his knees, hands gripping Shadow's fur. Mason turned back to Delgado, fury in his eyes. Time's up, asshole. And he swung. Gunfire rattled through the warehouse, drowning out the shouts and screams of the frenzied crowd. Smoke still hung thick in the air, swirling in chaotic patterns beneath the flickering overhead lights. Mason's lungs burned, his heart hammering as he pressed his back against a metal pillar, his pistol gripped tight. He was exposed now. Whatever cover his disguise had offered was gone, and Delgado's men were closing in. Through the haze, he could see Delgado retreating toward the VIP section, barking orders to his thugs. He wasn't running, he was regrouping. Mason didn't have time for this. A figure moved in the smoke to his left. Too fast, too close. He spun just as the first attacker lunged. The man was big, armed with a club, swinging hard. Mason barely dodged, the weapon slamming into the metal post where his head had been an instant earlier. The impact vibrated through the warehouse, but Mason was already moving. He countered fast. His elbow slammed into the man's gut, forcing a wheezing grunt from him. The moment of weakness was all Mason needed. He twisted the attacker's arm, wrenched the club away, and brought it crashing down across his jaw. The thug dropped, out cold. No time to celebrate. Another shadow lunged from the right. Mason whirled, throwing his weight into a kick that connected squarely with the second attacker's knee. A sickening pop echoed through the room as the man howled in pain, collapsing onto the concrete floor. 2 down. Too many to go. Mason's ears caught movement behind him. He ducked, just in time. A blade whistled past his ear, barely missing him. His attacker, a wiry man with serpentine tattoos running up his arms, twisted the knife back for another strike. Mason caught his wrist, twisted hard, and drove the thug's own weapon into his stomach. The man's breath hitched, eyes wide with shock before he crumpled to the floor. 3 down. But where the hell was Jake? Jake had no room for fear. The warehouse had turned into a war zone, and he was in the middle of it, his every sense straining to make up for what his eyes couldn't see. Gunshots echoed from the left. Mason. Footsteps thundered ahead, unsteady, panicked, a man running. Jake sidestepped instinctively, sticking close to the shadows. His military training kicked in, guiding him through the chaos. The crowd was fleeing now. The spectators, the rich, the powerful, the twisted, were trampling over each other to escape. He ignored them. Shadow was still in the ring. He could hear it. The snarls, the wet, ragged breathing, the metallic scent of blood thick in the air. And the other dog, Reaper, still alive, still attacking. Jake swallowed hard. He knew what Shadow was trained for. He was a K9, a warrior, a protector. But this wasn't a battlefield. This wasn't a fight for justice. This was survival. Jake moved toward the ring, every sound a guide. Sudden click, a safety being switched off. Gun Jake twisted just in time, barely dodging the shot. The muzzle flash burned into the darkness of his vision, the heat of the bullet grazing past his arm. He reacted instantly. With practiced precision, he pivoted, his hands finding the attacker's arm, using the thug's own momentum against him. A struggle, a grunt. Jake drove his knee hard into the man's stomach, forcing him to loosen his grip on the weapon. Then, with a fluid motion, Jake grabbed the pistol, flipped it in his hands, and fired. A single deafening shot. The thug collapsed. Jake exhaled. Gripping the pistol tight, he didn't have time to think. Shadow needed him. Inside the pit, Shadow was losing. Blood dripped from his muzzle, his breathing ragged. His front leg buckled slightly, but he still stood, still bared his teeth. Reaper circled him, a predator sensing weakness. The Rottweiler was a beast, trained for blood, hardened by the fights he'd been forced into. Shadow had been trained for service, for protection, not for this. A cruel laugh echoed from the side of the ring. "You had a good run, Mutt." One of Delgado's men sneered. Reaper lunged. Shadow dodged. Barely. His back leg gave out for a second, and Reaper's jaws clamped down on his shoulder, a yelp of pain. The crowd, what was left of it, cheered for blood. Jake heard it. He clenched his fists. "Shadow!" The command rang through the warehouse like a gunshot, and Shadow reacted. Despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, he remembered. Shadow's body snapped into focus. He wasn't a victim. He wasn't prey. He was trained. With a sudden burst of energy, Shadow twisted, breaking free from Reaper's hold. The shift in weight threw the Rottweiler off balance. Shadow used the opening, his jaws clamped around Reaper's throat, a precise takedown maneuver learned in his years of training. Reaper let Out a strangled yelp, his legs flailing, but he was done. The fight was over. Shadow had won. Jake was already moving toward the cage, his hands gripping the metal bars. "Hold on, boy," he whispered. "I've got you." Mason was bleeding from a gash on his arm, but he was still standing. Delgado's men were falling back, their leader nowhere to be seen. But one man remained, Carlos Vega, Delgado's right-hand enforcer. He leveled a shotgun at Mason. "Game over," Vega snarled. Mason didn't flinch. He kept his eyes locked on Vega, his own gun raised. A long moment. Then, Mason fired first. The bullet tore through Vega's shoulder, spinning him backward. He hit the ground, groaning, the shotgun clattering away. That was it. The criminals started scattering, running for the exits. The ring was over. Mason exhaled, gripping his wounded arm. He turned, just in time to see Jake wrench open Shadow's cage, and for the first time in days, Shadow ran free, straight into Jake's waiting arms. Mason stepped toward them, watching as Jake knelt, hands buried in Shadow's fur. The dog licked at Jake's face, whining softly. "You did good, buddy," Jake murmured. "You did real good." Mason felt something in his chest. Something unfamiliar. Relief. Pride. Redemption. He looked down at Vega's unconscious body, at the criminals fleeing in panic. They had won the battle. But the war wasn't over yet. Delgado was still out there. And Mason knew deep in his bones, this wasn't over. Not yet. The warehouse had descended into chaos. Bodies on the floor, criminals scattering, and the sound of distant sirens echoing in the night. But for Jake Carter, everything came down to one thing. The cold steel of a gun barrel pressed against his temple. His pulse pounded in his ears as Ray, Bones Delgado, tightened his grip around his neck, using him as a human shield. Delgado's breath was hot against his skin, laced with rage and desperation. "Drop the gun, Mason," Delgado snarled, "or I'll blow his goddamn head off." Mason stood a few feet away, gun raised, blood dripping from his injured arm. His entire body was coiled, like a spring, but his damn hands, weren't steady. Not out of fear, but because this was it. The moment everything came down to Jake, his unlikely ally, the man he had wronged, the man who forced him to confront who he truly was at Delgado's mercy. And the worst part? There was no clear shot. Mason's mind raced, scanning the situation, his heartbeat loud in his ears. Delgado was an experienced killer, a survivor. If Mason took the shot and missed, Jake was dead. If he hesitated too long, Jake was dead. And Shadow. The dog stood at the edge of the confrontation, his muscles rigid, ears pinned forward, teeth bared. His golden fur was matted with blood, some of it his own, but none of that mattered. His focus was locked on Delgado, and Delgado knew it. You take one more step, and the dog watches his master die, Delgado spat, pressing the gun harder against Jake's temple. Jake didn't flinch. Even as his breathing slowed, as his mind calculated the odds, he knew one thing for certain. Shadow was waiting for a command, a single word. Mason, gripping his gun, knew it too. This wasn't his fight to finish. It was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, Mason did the right thing. He lowered his gun. Delgado sneered. "Smart man. Now get on your knees." But Mason wasn't looking at him anymore. He was looking at Shadow. Jake inhaled sharply. Then, "Shadow, take." The word triggered pure instinct. Shadow exploded forward with a speed that defied his injuries, closing the distance between himself and Delgado in a blur of muscle and fur. Delgado saw it coming. Too late. The gun jerked away from Jake's head as he tried to aim at the lunging dog. But Shadow was too fast. Teeth sank deep into Delgado's forearm. A scream tore from Delgado's throat as the gun clattered to the floor. Jake moved. Without hesitation, he whipped around, his elbow slamming into Delgado's ribs with brutal precision. The impact sent Delgado staggering, giving Shadow the leverage to twist and throw him off balance. The criminal kingpin collapsed onto his back, cursing and struggling, but Shadow didn't let go. His teeth were locked in, his growls deep and guttural. Mason moved in, his boot slamming down onto Delgado's wrist before he could reach for his weapon. Delgado let out a choked gasp, his eyes darting between the three of them. Mason's gun, now aimed at his face, Jake standing over him and Shadow still snarling, teeth bared and dripping with his blood. It was over. Finally. Jake exhaled, chest heaving. Mason pressed the barrel of his gun against Delgado's forehead. "You done?" Mason asked coldly. Delgado's lip curled, but his breathing was ragged. He was defeated. The king of the underground dogfighting ring, brought down by a blind man, a disgraced cop, and a retired K-9. Jake stepped forward, his voice like steel. "Call off your men, now." Delgado's mouth tightened. The warehouse was quieter now. Most of his crew had already fled or fallen. The ones still standing were hesitating, watching their boss on the floor, at the mercy of a dog that once wore a badge. Then the moment was sealed. The sirens arrived. Flashing lights flooded the warehouse entrance as the police stormed in. "Hands where I can see them." The voice rang out, Detective Lisa Raines. Mason barely had time to turn before she and her team moved in, guns drawn. Officers swarmed the warehouse, securing the last of Delgado's men. Delgado tried to squirm, but Shadow growled, keeping him pinned. "You're done, Delgado," Raines snapped, striding forward. She glanced at Mason. "I should have known you'd make a mess of things." Mason grinned. Wouldn't have it any other way. Jake let out a sharp breath, releasing all the tension that had built up over the last few days. He dropped to a knee, running his hands over Shadow's fur. "You okay, buddy?" he whispered. Shadow whined softly, licking at his face. Jake smiled. For the first time in a long time, it felt like the world was right again. Delgado, still on the ground, sneered. "You really think this ends here?" He spat. Raines didn't blink as she gestured to her officers. "Cuff him." The moment the cold metal snapped around Delgado's wrists, Mason let out a long, relieved breath. It was over. The ring was shut down. The man who had stolen Shadow, who had ruined so many lives, was finally going to face justice. But for Jake, this wasn't about vengeance. This was about getting his best friend back. As the last of the criminals were loaded into patrol cars, Mason, Jake, and Raines stood near the warehouse entrance, watching the flashing red and blue lights illuminate the darkened sky. "You did good, Mason," Raines admitted. Mason gave a half shrug. "I had help." Jake turned toward him, his expression unreadable. There was still tension between them, but there was also understanding. "You trusted Shadow," Jake finally said. "You made the right call." Mason nodded. Jake reached down, resting his hand on Shadow's back. The dog leaned into him, tail wagging slightly despite his exhaustion. "You sure you don't want back on the force?" Raines asked Mason. He exhaled, staring out at the city. "Nah," he said. "I think I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." Jake smirked. "And where's that?" Mason glanced down at Shadow. "Trying to be a better man than I was yesterday." Jake considered that for a moment, then nodded. "Guess that makes two of us." Shadow let out a soft woof, and for the first time in a long time, Jake knew they were finally free. The warehouse bust was the beginning, not the end. Over the next several weeks, everything unraveled. Ray Bones Delgado's arrest sent shockwaves through the city. His dogfighting ring wasn't just some underground operation. It had connections, and worse, some of those connections were in uniform, corrupt officers, men Mason once trusted. Mason had a choice: stay silent and save himself, or come clean and burn every bridge he had left. For the first time in his life, the choice was easy. With Raines' backing, Mason turned in every piece of evidence he had. The dirty cops, the ones who ignored stolen service animals and let Delgado operate with impunity, were exposed. Names, dates, deals, every dirty secret. By the time the dust settled, 3 officers were indicted, including Mason's former captain and Mason. His career was dead. But for the first time in a long time, his honor wasn't. Jake Carter had always lived by one simple rule: never trust cops. And yet, here he was, sitting across from a former one in a courtroom. Jake had been asked to testify on Mason's behalf, not about the dogfighting ring, not about Delgado. That was already handled. This was about Mason. With the kind of evidence Mason had provided, it wasn't just the dirty cops going down. It was his own future on the line. Some prosecutors wanted to charge him, arguing he had turned a blind eye to corruption for years before finally coming clean. Jake had every reason to walk away and let Mason deal with his own mess. But he didn't, because Mason had changed. And Jake wasn't the man he had been before all this either. So when they asked him whether Mason deserved prison or a second chance, Jake answered, he made mistakes, but he also made it right. That's more than most people ever do. Mason was spared jail time, but the badge? Gone. Forever. And somehow Mason didn't seem to mind. The story of Shadow, the retired K9-turned-guide dog who survived a dogfighting ring, spread fast. People rallied behind him. Veteran organizations, animal rights groups. Even the media couldn't get enough of the story. The blind man and the disgraced cop who took down a dogfighting empire. It wasn't long before Shadow became a symbol. News stations ran features. Donations flooded in to help rehabilitate other stolen dogs. And, more importantly, Shadow made a full recovery. Jake had feared the worst, that his best friend would never be the same after what Delgado put him through. But Shadow? Shadow was a fighter, and when he finally stood tall again, his golden fur clean, his scars healing, he wasn't just Jake's guide dog anymore. He was a survivor, a hero. With everything settled, Jake knew he should have felt at peace. But something was missing. For years he had lived in survival mode, drifting, taking odd jobs, never truly belonging anywhere. But after everything he and Mason had been through, after the fights, the danger, the war they had won together, Jake realized something. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. Mason must have felt the same way, because one day out of the blue he called Jake with a proposal. "I'm starting something," Mason had said. "A private security firm. Nothing shady, nothing crooked, just vets helping vets. Guys like you, guys like me, people who need a second shot." Jake had scoffed at first. "I don't take charity." "Good," Mason had replied, "because I'm not offering any. I'm offering a job." And that was how, despite everything, Jake Carter, the blind man who had learned to trust no one, found himself in business with Greg Mason. And Shadow? Shadow would never see another fight again, but he would stand beside them every step of the way. The city was quieter now. Jake, Mason, and Shadow walked down a side street near their new office, a small, no-frills place, just enough space for a fresh start. "I still don't trust you," Jake muttered, hands in his pockets. Mason smirked. "Yeah? Well, I still don't like you," Shadow huffed, wagging his tail. They stopped at the front door, staring up at the sign they had just put up that morning. Carter and Mason Security. Jake ran his fingers over the raised letters. "Has a nice ring to it." Mason shrugged. "Better than Mason and Carter." Jake chuckled. "Damn right it is." The two men exchanged a glance. Not quite friends, not quite enemies, just two men who had been broken in different ways, who had made mistakes, who had fought to make it right. And now they were partners. Jake took a deep breath, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Shadow let out a quiet bark, and together, the three of them stepped forward, not just into an office, not just into a business, but into the next chapter of their lives, stronger, smarter, and finally free.